The face in the window. A secluded cabin deep in the woods, surrounded by trees and darkness. Family decided to spend the weekend at a remote cabin they had rented in the woods. It was supposed to be a relaxing getaway, far from the noise of the city. The cabin was old, but charming, with large windows that looked out into the thick forest. The first night was peaceful, with the family gathered around the fireplace, playing games and telling stories. But as the night grew darker, the atmosphere began to change. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and the fire began to die down. The youngest daughter, Emily, was the first to notice something strange. As she looked out the window, she thought she saw a face staring back at her. It was just a brief glimpse, a pale, ghostly face with hollow eyes. She told her parents, but they laughed it off, saying it was just her imagination. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She kept glancing at the window, expecting to see the face again, but there was nothing there. The rest of the family went to bed, but Emily couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind outside. Just as she was about to drift off, she heard a noise. A soft tapping at the window. She sat up, her heart pounding, and slowly turned to look. There, outside the window, was the face again, clearer this time, and much closer. It was pressed against the glass, staring straight at her. Emily screamed and her parents came running. But when they turned on the lights and looked out the window, there was nothing there. They checked the yard, the porch, even the surrounding woods, but found no sign of anyone. The next morning, they decided to cut their trip short. They packed up quickly, eager to leave the creepy cabin behind. But as they were loading the car, Emily's father noticed something strange on the outside of the cabin. Handprints smeared across the windows, as if someone had been standing outside, watching them. They didn't tell Emily, not wanting to scare her further, but they couldn't shake the uneasy feeling as they drove away. Later, after they had returned home, they decided to look up the history of the cabin. What they found chilled them to the bone. Years ago, a man had lived in that cabin, a recluse who rarely ventured into town. He was known for his strange behavior and eerie presence. One winter, he vanished without a trace, and no one ever found his body. But some say that on cold, windy nights, he still haunts the woods, staring through the windows of the cabin, searching for those who dare to stay there. And if you ever rent a cabin in these woods, make sure to close the curtains tight, or you might just see his face staring back at you. The Forgotten Cabin. A remote campsite near an old forgotten cabin deep in the woods. A group of friends decided to go camping deep in the woods, far from the usual sights, seeking adventure. They hiked for hours, finally finding a clearing that seemed perfect. As they set up camp, one of them noticed something strange through the trees. A small, weathered cabin, hidden in the shadows. Curious, they decided to check it out. The cabin was old, with the wood rotting and vines creeping up the walls. The door creaked open easily, revealing a dusty interior. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Inside, they found old furniture, a rusted stove, and a fireplace filled with ash. But the strangest thing was the table in the middle of the room, set as if someone was about to sit down for dinner. There were 4 plates, 4 cups, and 4 chairs, all covered in a thick layer of dust, but there were no signs of life. No explanation for why everything was left as it was. The friends joked about it, taking photos and poking around. But something about the place felt off. As night fell, they returned to their campsite, but the cabin was still on their minds. They couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The woods seemed quieter than usual, the sounds of the night muffled, almost as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Around midnight, they heard a noise, a faint creaking, like an old door slowly opening. They looked toward the cabin, and to their horror, they saw a faint light flickering inside. It was as if someone had lit a candle. One of the friends, braver than the rest, decided to go check it out, convinced it was just their imagination. He walked to the cabin, flashlight in hand, while the others waited anxiously by the fire. Minutes passed, and the woods seemed to grow darker. Suddenly, the flashlight beam wavered and went out. The friends called out to him, but there was no answer. Then, without warning, the cabin door slammed shut. Panic set in, and they ran to the cabin, calling their friend's name. When they burst through the door, the cabin was dark and empty. Their friend was gone, but the table had been disturbed. One of the chairs was pulled out, and the dust on one of the plates had been wiped clean, as if someone had just sat down to eat. They searched the woods for hours, but their friend was never found. Eventually they gave up and returned to town, where they told the authorities what had happened. The search party found nothing, but one of the old-timers in town told them a story. Years ago, a family had lived in that cabin, isolated from the rest of the world. They were never seen again, and the cabin was left to rot. But every once in a while, campers would go missing, and people would say that the family was still there, waiting for someone to join them for dinner. And if you listen closely, you can still hear the sound of that creaking door, inviting you inside. The Lonely Road. A long, deserted road that cuts through an empty stretch of land, with no lights or houses in sight. There's a stretch of road out in the middle of nowhere, a place where people say time stands still. It's a long, empty highway, with nothing but miles of barren land on either side. Those who travel it say, it's the loneliest road in the world, and some even say, it's cursed. One night, a truck driver was making his way down that road, hauling a load across the state. He'd driven this route before, but tonight felt different. The road seemed longer, the darkness deeper. His headlights barely cut through the thick blackness, and the radio only played static. As he drove, he saw a figure on the side of the road. A man standing alone in the dark, thumbing for a ride. The trucker slowed down, his better judgment telling him to keep driving. But something about the man's face seemed familiar. Against his better judgment, he pulled over. The man climbed into the cab, thanking the driver in a low, tired voice. He was dressed in old, worn clothes, and his face was pale and drawn. The trucker asked where he was headed, and the man gave him an address a few towns over, somewhere along the highway. They drove in silence for a while, the only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional bump in the road. The trucker couldn't shake the feeling that he'd seen this man before, but he couldn't place where. As they neared the town, the man asked to be let out at the next crossroad. The trucker obliged, pulling over to the side of the road. The man thanked him again and disappeared into the night. The trucker watched him go, but when he looked back at the seat, he noticed something odd. The man had left something behind. It was a photo, old and faded, showing the same man standing next to a truck, identical to the one the trucker was driving. But the date on the back of the photo was from over 20 years ago. Confused and unsettled, the trucker continued on to his destination. When he arrived at the address the man had given him, he found an old, rundown house with boarded-up windows. A neighbor saw him looking and came over. The trucker showed the neighbor the photo and asked if they knew the man. The neighbor's face turned white as a sheet. He told the trucker that the man in the photo was his father, who had died on this very road over 20 years ago. He had been a truck driver too, and he'd never made it home that night. And ever since, they say he's been hitching rides on that lonely road, trying to find his way back home. The Phantom Hitchhiker. A dark, lonely road with a history of strange occurrences. A few years ago, there was a young couple driving home late at night after a weekend getaway. The road they took was isolated, winding through miles of forest with no cell service and no signs of civilization. The only light came from their headlights and the occasional glow of the moon. As they drove, they saw something up ahead. A figure standing by the side of the road, thumbing for a ride. It was a woman, drenched from the rain, her hair hanging in wet strands over her face. The couple hesitated but decided to stop and help her. After all, it was a cold, rainy night and the nearest town was miles away. The woman didn't say much when she got in, just thanked them softly and gave an address in the next town. The couple tried to make small talk, but she was distant, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. As they drove, the woman began to shiver uncontrollably, so the girlfriend offered her a blanket from the back seat. The woman took it without a word and wrapped it around herself. The rest of the ride was silent, the atmosphere in the car growing more uncomfortable by the minute. When they finally reached the address, it was an old, dilapidated house at the end of a long driveway. The woman stepped out of the car, thanked them again, and disappeared into the darkness. The couple drove away, relieved to be back on the road. But as they reached the edge of town, the girlfriend realized something. The blanket she'd given the woman was still in the back seat. They pulled over, confused, and checked the back seat. The blanket was there, neatly folded, and underneath it, they found something chilling. A photograph. It was a picture of the woman, standing in front of the house they had just dropped her off at. But there was something wrong with the picture. The date on it was nearly 20 years old, and the woman looked exactly the same. Disturbed, they drove to the nearest gas station and asked the attendant if he knew anything about the house. The man's face went pale when they mentioned it. He told them that the house had been abandoned for years. The woman who lived there had died in a car accident on that very road, hitchhiking home one stormy night. And ever since then, she's been trying to get home, hoping that one day someone will finally take her all the way. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows through the dense forest. Emily and Tom had been camping for a few days, and the forest had an unnerving quietness to it that neither of them could shake. They had decided to go out for an evening hunt, hoping to catch something for dinner. Tom checked his gear meticulously, while Emily scanned the surrounding trees, her unease barely concealed. "It's so quiet," she remarked, her voice low. Tom nodded, adjusting his rifle. "Yeah, it's almost too quiet. But let's focus. We need to be extra careful in this kind of silence." They walked through the thick underbrush, their boots making soft crunching sounds on the leaf-covered ground. As they reached a small clearing, Emily set up her spot, and Tom chose a position a bit further into the forest, where he had a good view of the surrounding area. They agreed to stay in touch via radio, ready to regroup if necessary. An hour into their hunt, Emily was starting to feel the weight of the silence. The forest was devoid of the usual sounds of wildlife, and even the wind seemed to have died down. She shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting around. Suddenly she heard a faint rustling noise behind her, followed by a low, guttural sound. It was unlike anything she had heard before. Her heart began to race. She raised her rifle, scanning the darkening trees. The rustling grew louder, accompanied by what sounded like a distant whispering. "Tom, do you hear that?" Emily whispered urgently into the radio. There was a moment of static before Tom's voice came through. "Yeah, I hear it. I haven't seen anything unusual, though. Keep your eyes peeled." Emily tried to steady her breathing as the rustling noise seemed to draw closer. Shadows danced around her, and she could swear she saw movement just beyond the edge of the clearing. Her instincts told her to move, but her legs felt rooted to the spot. Then, without warning, the noise stopped. The forest was eerily silent again. Emily's gaze was fixed on the spot where she had seen the movement. A cold sweat formed on her brow. She scanned the area once more, but there was nothing. Just the oppressive silence of the forest. And, "Emily, are you okay?" Tom's voice crackled through the radio, breaking the tension. Emily responded shakily, "I'm fine, but I'm really spooked. There was something out here, but now it's gone. I'm coming over to you." Tom agreed, and Emily made her way cautiously through the forest, her senses heightened. As she approached Tom's location, she saw his silhouette against the dim light of the setting sun. He looked concerned. "Did you see anything?" Emily asked, her voice trembling slightly. Tom shook his head. No, but I've been getting a weird feeling too. It's like we're being watched. They decided to pack up and head back to camp. As they walked, the shadows of the trees seemed to loom larger and more menacing. The unsettling feeling that they were not alone persisted, and every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made them jump. Back at camp, the fire crackled loudly in the darkness, a welcome distraction from the eerie atmosphere of the forest. They sat close together, their nerves still on edge, and tried to shake off the unease from the hunt. Despite the warmth of the fire, a chill remained in the air, a reminder of the strange, unsettling experience they had just encountered. As they settled into their tent, the sounds of the forest seemed to return to normal. The whispering and rustling had ceased, but the feeling of being watched lingered. Emily and Tom huddled together, the night feeling unusually long and unsettling, the eerie silence of the forest still echoing in their minds.